Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific. Hello, welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. My name's Richard Dunley and I'm joined by my co-host Jennifer Parker. We're recording on Monday the 1st of September. As ever, if anything massive happens in the region and we don't mention it, that's why. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we unpack the key developments that are shaping maritime security and maritime affairs in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. So let's dive in. Hi Jen, what have you been up to over the past week or so?
Hey Richard, great to see you. We are a little bit overdue on this podcast.
As ever.
So I think it's been more than a week or so, but that just keeps people in suspense waiting for it. What am I up to? I had a piece in the Sydney Morning Herald Friday, Saturday, talking about the US-Australia alliance, expectations aligned. You know, we often talk about the fact that, you know, our two countries have fought together since the Battle of Hamel in 1918 in northern France, but actually when you look at the types of conflicts we've fought together in, most of them have been different types of conflicts where the Australian homeland and Australian civilians are not at risk, with the exception of World War II. So it kind of asks the question of, are roles and responsibilities clear, and proposes what I think should be Australia's roles and responsibilities. So I'll put a link to that in the show notes if you're interested in reading that. What else? I'm not even sure. I can't even remember the last time I spoke to you. What have you been up to, Richard?
Oh, not a huge amount of this kind of related stuff. I've been battling university work, which is I guess what I'm paid to do, but it's certainly less fun than talking about maritime strategy and these sorts of things. So you wanted to flag something that was in the mentioned in our comments.
Oh, look, I thought I'd just flag that, you know, thank you to those that make comments. Thank you to those who watch this and listen to this. Super excited to see the last episode in terms of viewers. We had 4.7 thousand on YouTube, which is great, and a couple of additional thousand who listened to it. And we do get lots of comments. We do try and respond to them. We're not so great at it. It does take a lot of effort. There were two that we will talk about in this episode very briefly. One was a question about the differences or a comparison between the upgraded Mogami, which we spoke about extensively in our last podcast, which is Australia's new general purpose frigate coming in 2029 onwards, and the Hunter-class frigate, which is, I guess in Australia we call it the future frigate. They're both future frigates, but we call it the future frigate, which will be coming in 2032. And what are the differences? And they're quite different. I think. Although Richard's
I'm your optimism about 2032.
I don't hate the Hunter as much as I really don't. I like it.
I think 2034 is the current date. But
2032 launch, 2034 commissioning.
Okay, all right, fine.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
And we're also asked a question about blockades and prize warfare. So we'll try and get to those things in this podcast. We'll probably go back and look at the recording of this as we edit the podcast and realise we didn't discuss them. But that is our commitment, so we'll see how we go. Richard, what's been happening in the region?
So the most significant thing that's been happening in the region over the past week or so has been Exercise Alon, which is billed at least as the ADF's largest overseas exercise this year. 1,600 ADF personnel over the past 2 weeks. It finished wrapped up on Friday. Significant kind of deployment of both ADF but also AFP personnel and other things, including kind of cyber and space involvement. Also participation from the US Marine Corps and the Royal Canadian Navy. So quite a significant exercise, also reasonably high-end in terms of sort of the framing of the intensity of the exercise. So this was very much a high-end warfighting focused exercise. It included an amphibious landing on Palawan with the sort of by the Australian Army and Philippine Marine Corps units, live fire exercises in the South China Sea, and some other bits and pieces that we'll maybe pull out a little bit more in a second. What are your thoughts about exercise Alon and possibly even talking about this potential defence agreement?
So I'm going to be mean and say that this is our second iteration of recording, and in the first recording, I do feel like Richard called it exercise Alon. He didn't, but it sounded a bit like that, and I'm just going to put that out there. Anyway, that's mean. Apart from that, I thought it was a really good exercise. I didn't track it that closely, got to say. But I guess the point being is that it is getting larger every iteration of this. I mean, I think that kind of coincides with the closeness that is developing between the Australia-Philippines relationship, defence relationship, and we certainly saw that. So during the exercise, Alon, now I'm going to stuff it up. Exercise Alon's very Australian. Exercise Alon, which I think you were telling me before, right? It means wave or something?
That is my understanding. It means wave.
Right.
But our combined pronunciation of Philippine languages is, I would suggest, relatively minimal. So we might well be corrected by some of our listeners who are going to be screaming at their devices, telling us how we've got it all wrong.
Well, please do. But during the exercise, we actually saw the Australia's Deputy Prime Minister, our Defence Minister, head to the Philippines, and it was announced that we were working on a new defence agreement as well, which kind of is symbolic of how close the relationship's becoming, and also how, I guess, complex this exercise is becoming. Yes, Australia does exercises with many, many countries, but really when you want to determine the closeness of the relationship between a country, it's not whether an exercise exists, it's really the complexity of which the exercise goes to. And you can certainly see that this, from amphibious operations through to live fires, etc., is growing in complexity and also significant, I think, because it's a bilateral exercise with the Philippines. Yes, absolutely. We've done a lot with the Philippines in the last kind of decade or a bit longer to do with, I guess, counter-terrorism, counter-piracy. But, until kind of more recently, a lot of the more high-end stuff we did was actually in a trilateral format with the US. So I think that's a significant as well.
So I completely agree with you, particularly in terms of the bilateral focus. And it comes back, I guess, to the previous US administration would often talk about this idea of a lattice work in the region rather than a kind of a hub and spoke type arrangement. And you are seeing, whether or not that remains American policy, you're seeing this continue to develop in terms of the strengthening of relations between countries that are kind of like-minded countries within the region who are often US allies, but you're seeing strengthening of the bilateral relations between them, as well as continued strong relations with the United States. So I think it definitely fits into that element of it. One thing that I think is probably worth pulling out is a specific component, as I understand it, a component of this exercise were some drills that were carried out near Scarborough Shoal that sort of included naval assets and air assets. And so you saw Australian, Canadian, and Philippine warships and aircraft from certainly the Royal Australian Air Force and the Philippine Air Force working together as part of a simulated air attack. And you're seeing sort of the significant units from the Philippines Navy. So their flagship, a relatively new frigate, a Canadian frigate, and HMS Brisbane. And this included, as I say, fighters from the RAAF that I think are FA-18 Super Hornets. So quite high-end exercise, obviously in a very sensitive and strategic region. So both in terms of the developing of the complexity of the exercise and the training and benefit that comes out of that, but also very much in terms of the signalling of what's going on here. There's quite a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, I thought this was a really important demonstration Yes, it was kind of tacked onto the end of Exercise Alon with the Canadians involved. But I think the proximity, we don't know how close it was to Scarborough Shoal. It just says to the east of Scarborough Shoal. But I think the proximity is significant. We have been increasingly seeing these multilateral maritime cooperative activities, MMCAs, or just exercises, between a series of countries. Australia's been quite involved in this, and really they seem to have been timed to provide demonstrations, and they often seem to come a couple of weeks after there has been a significant incident in the South China Sea between Philippines and Chinese vessels. So this one, I think, and often when they occur, we don't really know where they occur. It's not really signified, I would suspect, away from contested areas. But this one clearly signified in the press releases that this has occurred close to Scarborough Shoal, which is a highly contested area. And of course, we saw the incident probably, I guess, a month back now or close to between the Chinese Coast Guard, Chinese Navy, and the Philippines Coast Guard, which resulted in a collision between the Chinese Navy and the Chinese Coast Guard. And we have seen this, I guess, ramp up of activities this year around Scarborough Shoal from the Chinese Coast Guard and the Chinese military. So clearly this was aimed at sending a message as well, which is one of the great things that naval forces are capable of doing by where they operate and where they send their exercises. So I thought this was really good. Great to see the Canadian Navy engaged in it as well. Any other comments on that?
No, I think that, as you say, it's very clearly a demonstration, and again, the tying of the Canadians into this, I think, is noteworthy. Certainly, the presence and relatively persistent presence of Canadian naval assets in the Indo-Pacific, or this bit of the Indo-Pacific is something that has been a significant change over the past 12 to 18 months, or certainly it feels that way. So, yeah, very noteworthy.
And interesting, I think, given the, we won't dwell on this, but given the issues the Canadian Navy is experiencing, we talk a lot about the issues the Australian Navy is experiencing in terms of the number and age of hulls, and that's something that the Canadian Navy is also very much experiencing. In fact, perhaps even to a higher degree than the Australian Navy. So it is, I guess, important. I think somebody said we say interesting too much on this podcast, by the way, and I've just said it 4 times in a sentence. So if you said that on YouTube, you are correct. However, it probably won't change.
Sorry, it's also, I think it's coda that I use for trying to imply things without necessarily always saying things outright.
How very academic of you.
Absolutely. Anyway, what else has been going on? I was
going to make a point. It's going to be a great point as well. It was an interesting point, which was,
go for it.
Despite the issues that the Canadian Navy is experiencing, and despite the pressure they're experiencing in terms of increased Russian operations as well, in their neck of the woods, they are still deploying to the Indo-Pacific, which just shows how important they see the Indo-Pacific to their security. So that was my interesting point. Anyway, all right, we've got to move on. What are we moving on to?
What else is happening in the region?
Oh, you want me to move on to it? Okay.
Absolutely.
Right, so, look, there's a bunch of things happening right now, to be honest. I mean, the Prince of Wales is still in the region. It's in Northeast Asia at the moment, alongside Japan for Pacific Forum, which I nearly went to but had to sadly decline. But that looks like a great maritime conference. So the Prince of Wales is still here. There is a bunch of things happening. We won't have time to talk about all of them, but one of the ones that I think is an interesting to watch this week is there is going to be a huge military parade in China on the 3rd of September. If you don't know about it, it means you have not turned on a news channel in the last week. So it marks the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second Sino-Japanese War. And it's meant to be a grand military parade. Now, they actually did this on the 70th anniversary as well in 2015, so there is precedent for this. The Sino-Japanese War, of course, being from 1937 to 1945. I've seen some reporting saying it marks the end of the Second World War. It's actually marking something slightly different, although the timings coincide. We have seen a number of statements from senior PLA officers saying that we will see some new capabilities on display. What these new capabilities will be, not exactly clear. There have been some photos of rehearsals this parade that have come out. There's a good piece in Naval News by H.I. Sutton that looks at the extra large uncrewed underwater vehicles that have been displayed in some of these rehearsals. Now, we do know that China has an active uncrewed surface vessel and uncrewed underwater vehicle program. Every now and then we see photos that come out, but we actually don't have a lot of detail in the same way we have detail about, Australia's, well, I know you think we don't have a lot of detail on Australia's Go Shark program. We have more detail on Australia's Go Shark program than we do on China's XLUUV program in the US Orca. So I think there's some interesting comments that HI Sutton makes in terms of some of these XLUUV capabilities that might be on display. I think it'll be interesting to see what naval capabilities are on display in this parade and what is new, because there have been a number of statements now from PLA officers saying that there's going to be new capabilities. So I think that is an interesting one to watch. Of course, the other interesting element that you will have seen in the news, which we won't delve into too much, is who is going. So the president of Russia will be in attendance. Of course, Putin will be there. China's not a signatory to the Rome Statute, so their view is they don't comply with ICC warrants for arrest. Obviously, neither does the US, given that he was in Alaska a couple of weeks ago. Of course, the North Korean president will also be there. Modi from India is meant to be there. A bunch of countries from Asia have been listed, although not as many as I would have thought. And interestingly, there have been some former Australian politicians that have also been invited. But I guess the point that I'll be really watching is what new naval capabilities are on display, and what does that tell us about China's growing, specifically uncrewed capabilities.
Yeah, I think certainly the XL UUVs or the UUVs in general is going to be one of the areas, one of the other areas where we've seen through this type of parades and this type of things before. We've seen capabilities revealed or better images of specific capabilities is around long-range missiles and People's Liberation Army Rocket Force. And I suspect, and we've already seen some images of different bits and pieces of kit, and whether or not we're going to see anything particularly revelatory there, I'm not sure. But again, that's another area where I think that there'll be quite a lot of interested eyes, at least. And again, we've got that word interested.
I was about to say, every time we say interesting, I'm like, oh, cringe.
Attentive eyes, let's say.
Attentive sounds very formal. That sounds very academic.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll try and be less academic.
You should.
Kind of goes against the mold.
So, anyway, look, lots happening in the region. We do have a lot to talk about in terms of capability development, so let's move on to that. One of the things I thought was interesting and probably interesting. Now it's going to crack me up every time I say it. Probably not worth labouring on too much, but look, we have seen this trend in the last couple of years of the US Marine Corps trying to demonstrate, discuss their role within a traditional naval capability discussion. So, of course, a key role in amphibiosity and elements like that. But trying to talk about aspects of sea control and sea denial with their maritime strike capabilities. But also, there's been a few papers and a few things written about their role from an anti-submarine warfare perspective. And so this is a bit of a late article, but early in August we did see an exercise occurring in the Philippine Sea where we saw US Marine Corps Ospreys deploying sonar buoys. And there was a number of statements from US Marine Corps officers about the role and utility of the US Marine Corps in an anti-submarine warfare aspect. So, of course, they don't have the ability to monitor those sonar buoys on these Ospreys, but it is another vector in which they can be deployed from. Now, I'm a little bit skeptical about the utility of deploying sonar buoys from Ospreys and wonder whether this is a genuine ASW tactical consideration or more about demonstrating a role. But I think it's interesting, and I think it, stepping back, I think it is important. And we are seeing this a little bit from the Australian Army conversation as well. Land forces really starting to look at clearly an Indo-Pacific fight. if there was to be a crisis or a conflict, would be very maritime in nature. Maritime, of course, meaning not just naval capability. So really seeing land forces trying to discuss new ideas about the utility in the maritime environment. So I thought this was interesting. Sonar buoys being deployed from Ospreys. I'm not sure about the tactical use moving forward. I think there is better use for Ospreys. But do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, so it certainly fits into a longer term trend of interest from the US Marine Corps in this. It was flagged, I think it was flagged within certainly the second of the tentative manuals on expeditionary advanced basing operations, and was discussed a little bit by General Berger before he passed on the baton as Commandant of the US Marine Corps. And it does fit into this idea of, well, what is the role of land forces in, particularly in the kind of the littoral regions in the Indo-Pacific? And I think there's something there. Now, clearly, you're seeing this with the massive growth in land-based maritime strike capability, whether it's HIMARS, whether it's your Japanese anti-ship missiles, whether it's your Typhoon or Typhon, or even the new prompt conventional strike missiles, which the US Army is looking at and beginning to deploy. So there's a dramatic increase in this bit of attempting to achieve sea control. But as you know, sea control requires sufficient control in 3 of the dimensions to be able to actually use the surface of the sea. You need to be able to control the air, the sea, and subsea. There is also increasing interest from the US Marine Corps, and I guess this has got a much longer history in that controlling the airspace. But the subsea bit of that problem has always been something that kind of has been handed off to the Navy. Whether or not that is possible to do, whether or not that is desirable to do, if you are looking at being able to use these forces in a sort of semi-independent way to provide you with a degree of sea control over a set of space, then there are definitely potential advantages in having an ASW or some form of ASW kind of capability. Now, whether or not that is really practicable, I think very much remains unclear. But it's really interesting, again, that wonderful word, the degree to which the US Marine Corps is really pushing this concept. And how, and this is where my academic side of things comes in, how this changes and this relationship between land power and sea power, and how that balance is definitely in flux at the moment. And this is another relatively small but quite important component of that. So definitely something to note. I'm a little skeptical, like you are, about the kind of operationalization of this. But the mere fact that you're seeing land forces thinking seriously about ASW is notable, right?
It is notable. My only other skepticism, apart from the tactical employment, is I do think that there is this broader conversation that the kind of naval warfare that we would have to undertake in the Indo-Pacific and the roles in which ships will have to undertake in the Indo-Pacific is something that, navies have talked about for a long time but have not done in recent conflicts, right? When we talk about recent conflicts in the naval warfare aspects, to be honest, it's really been the littoral, dealing with small boats, dealing with missiles, UAVs, etc. I do worry that there is this growing sentiment of how do we do this on the cheap? So solving it with UAVs and maritime strike capability and sonar buoys from Ospreys. And again, I have nothing kind of against this. I think it's important to work out how all aspects of a force contribute to this. But where I become concerned is where it is in place of the actual just investment that you need to do in terms of hulls and shipbuilding. And I think that, in the end, and we'll go talk about Hunter and Mogami in a second. In the end, countries need to build ships. There are, new ways to employ them, new things to complement them, et cetera, but countries just do need to also build ships. So I would much rather see the US, for example, focusing on how they get their ASW frigate built and to sea than Sona Boys from Ospreys. Would be my
I'm going to push back very slightly there on the basis that I absolutely agree with you that there are certain roles for which you need naval platforms, you need ships, right? But the Indo-Pacific is a very big place. Are you ever going to have enough hulls to do all of the things that you want to be able to do? No. And so I think that there is unquestionably a role for the persistence that land forces can offer and the scalability that they can offer. Now, does that mean that you should be trying to do this instead of building ships? No, absolutely not. But is it something I think that needs to be considered as well as? I would suggest that it is certainly something that is worth exploring.
And I didn't actually disagree with you. I mean, I certainly said I think it's worth exploring in a complementary fashion. But I am seeing from statements from senior leaders, from articles written, an increased view and comparison of in place of. So 4 strike masters in place of a Hobart. And that's where I think the narrative becomes dangerous. And not just ships, by the way. I'm also talking about, maritime patrol aircraft, more expensive equipment that you need to achieve these effective capabilities. There is no cheap solution out of some of these problems. Right. Speaking of shipbuilding and some of these problems, so we're asked to, I guess, provide some commentary. We've been asked on YouTube. This doesn't mean, by the way, if you put a question on YouTube that we'll always address it, because by and large, we thank you for your engagement. We probably won't have time. That said, I thought this was an interesting one, which is how do we think about the difference between the Mogami and the upgraded Mogami and the Hunter class, and what are those differences specifically? I guess the key point to note, so some people would probably respond to this by saying, well, the cost is what is dramatically different. The first thing I would probably highlight is not only are they different ships, but we're buying into different things. So when it comes to the Hunter class and it's being built in South Australia, one of the things we're actually buying into is this idea of continuous shipbuilding in Australia, which requires the development, unfortunately, because our continuous shipbuilding has never been continuous, requires the development of shipyards and workforces to build those capabilities. So that would probably be the first point I would make in terms of the comparison. Yeah, so I think that when you're talking about them and comparing them, you need to understand that the Hunter package is also Australia buying into the idea of continuous shipbuilding in South Australia and the building of a workforce and a yard, etc. I think the second point is a point made in the Defence Strategic Review, which is this idea of Tier 1 and Tier 2 ships. Now, it didn't really define Tier 1 versus Tier 2 ships and what that means in terms of capability. The way I interpret that is certainly in terms of the size of the ship and what that means for its command and control capability. So I certainly think that the Hunter, compared to the upgraded Mogami, will be much more of a C2 platform within a task group. Now, it has a great air defense radar system, but of course, as has been discussed, limitations in terms of the missiles that come associated with that. But certainly, I think we will be seeing that employed as a Tier 1 C2 platform. I think the other interesting comparison between the two is the mission bay. So both ships have mission bays, but the Hunter, because of the size of the ship, its mission bay is exceptionally large. Now, I was trying to get the details on exactly how much can fit in this mission bay. I haven't really managed to find that. Certainly, my understanding was something in the order of kind of 12 ISO containers, which is an exceptionally large mission bay. What that allows it to do is really engage with USV, UUV, UAV capability as that kind of comes online and is integrated into the ships, but also used for a number of other roles. So I think that probably points to the size. The upgraded Mogami, the standard load is reportedly around 4,500 tons. Full load reportedly around 6. The the Hunter, we often see it quoted as 10,000 tons. I did actually fact check this. Full load is actually 8,800 tons for Australia's Hunter class frigate at this stage. The length, 142 metres for the upgraded Mogami, which is significantly longer than the current Mogami, so about 9 metres longer. But the Hunter class is another 9 metres on that, so about 151 metres. The beam of the Hunter is 20.8 metres versus the upgraded Mogami, which is about 17-ish. Now, if you're doing an exam on this, don't quote my figures, but I'm just trying to give you orders of magnitude. And so you can see the size of that vessel being quite different. I think the other kind of thing to highlight in terms of the differences, of course, the crew. Now, the upgraded Mogami is reported to be about 90. I'll bet everybody a bottle of champagne it won't be 90. Crews are never... as I think we've discussed this on the podcast before, crews are never as stated by the shipbuilder, but certainly it will be significantly less than the Hunter. But the Hunter will be designed for different roles as well. And I mentioned that C2 role. Also, yes, the upgraded Mogami does have ASW capability. In fact, we don't know what will be specifically on Australia's upgraded Mogami, but the current Mogami operated by the Japanese does have a towed array system with variable depth, sonar, and active and passive capability. The Hunter will come with 2087, which I'm biased. I used to operate it, but I think is one of the best active towed array sonars in the world. And I would wonder whether we would actually, just to seek commonality, try and get 2087 onto the upgraded Mogami. The other element really, I think, is the design of the ship. So the Hunter class is designed from the hull up to be quiet. What that means is things like equipment is mounted, etc. So because of that, you also have an increased degree of survivability with respect to taking hits. The Mogami class is an ASW frigate, but not designed to be quiet. So yes, the towed array system has a passive capability, but it's not going to be as effective because the ship's not going to be as quiet, or at least on paper compared to the Hunter class. So that's probably the comparison points that I'd highlight. Richard, any comments on those? Any comparison there?
No, so certainly the primary focus of the original Type 26 or the Hunter class is very much an ASW focused platform. It comes out of an initial kind of British focus on ASW in the North Atlantic, and that is still a critical element of, and we might talk about this in a second, the British design, and then the Norwegians who've just bought into the design. So it is very much this ASW-centric design, which comes, as Jen said, with a range of additional things in terms of the size of the platform and the quietening and everything else that goes along with it. And whereas the Mogami is much more of a kind of a general purpose. It's part of was originally framed as a general purpose frigate program, and so that is very much how it would be viewed, certainly within a kind of an Australian context. Now, is the clarification or the stratification between a tier 1 and a tier 2 particularly clear at this point? I would suggest probably not. But I think a lot of these kind of comparisons and paper comparisons are pretty difficult to do, and all the more difficult at the moment because, frankly, we know very little about the upgraded Mogami, certainly the one that the Australians will end up getting. So there's a lot of moving parts here that we just don't actually know. So we can kind of speculate a little bit, but I think that's the rough drift.
I guess the other point to note about the Hunter too, and I'm just surmising, is how it may be employed in a task group. So I think that really the general purpose frigate will be the kind of standard escort ship. But really, depending on the threat, of course, depending on the types of operations you're doing, a towed array ship like the Hunter, designed from the hull up to be noise quiet, is normally employed ahead of the force, 10, 15, 20 nautical miles ahead of the force, depending on the situation, to really do that screening for submarines. or employed as an individual capability around specific threat areas, which is a lot of what we see of the Royal Navy's employment of specific ASW ships. So I think there's probably a difference there as well. Now, speaking of the Royal Navy's ASW ships, of course, the Hunter is built on the Type 26 capability, but in terms of commonality, it probably is only from about, I think the waterline down is really where the commonality stops, because Australia has modified it a fair bit. But the Type 26 has had some popularity. So who else is buying the Type 26?
Yeah, so as I very briefly mentioned a minute or so ago, the Norwegians announced overnight that they are acquiring 5 Type 26 hulls. These are going to be built in the UK, so they're buying pretty much directly off the shelf Type 26 rather than the global combat ship BAE kind of broader frame, which has then got the Hunter and the Canadian versions of this. And so the Norwegians are buying, basically, as I say, a Type 26 off the shelf. Delivery is supposed to be starting in 2029. Now, that is an incredibly tight time frame, which means that they will almost certainly be taking one of the existing UK hulls. It's likely to be either Hull 3 or Hull 4, so probably the ships that have been notionally christened HMS Belfast or HMS Birmingham. So the Type 26 program has had some challenges, but is progressing, and the first 2 ships are now have been launched and are fitting out. This is Glasgow and Cardiff, and they're supposed to be entering service from 2028. So this would then be a Norwegian ship entering service as or sort of the following year, and then you having a regular drumbeat of roughly 1 hull a year going forward. And this would then offer a combined force operating in kind of northern waters of 13 of these platforms, with very high levels of commonality between them. Now, there's been some kind of questions about the degree to which these are the right platforms for Norway, in exactly the same way there have been questions about Hunter for Australia. But clearly the ASW angle and the fact that these are primarily ASW-focused ships has sort of won the day, as opposed to a more general-purpose type approach, given the nature of the probable threat that the Norwegian Navy will be dealing with, which is largely Russian submarines. So it's been a big success for BAE. Now they've just got to make sure that they can deliver.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, it's good for Australia as well to see more Type 26. As I mentioned, the Hunter is not, I can't remember the percentage of commonality, but waterline
I've seen
below.
70% as a recent figure. Now, what does that actually mean? But yeah, those are the numbers that I've seen thrown around relatively recently.
Yeah. Well, it's either way. I think it's good to have similar versions of the frigates getting around. And will certainly help with sustainment and those kind of elements. Now, speaking of ships not getting around, like I'm getting good at these segues. I think so anyway. Richard, what's happening with the ex-HMAS Anzac?
So Babcock made an announcement last week or so about the fact they've managing to reclaim quite a lot of the equipment off what was HMAS Anzac. So as we talked about in an earlier episode of the podcast, Anzac was decommissioned earlier this year as basically it became unsustainable to continue to maintain her, and the maintenance challenges were simply too great. But there was quite a lot of relatively modern equipment. In fact, Anzac had been modernised, and so there was quite a lot of worth on there, and so they've managed to recover quite a lot of this equipment, including the VLS systems, elements of the propulsion, propellers, drivetrain, etc. And this, I guess, is part of a process which not only is about recovering bits of the equipment, but is also about managing the Anzac fleet as best as possible in order to eke out as much life as they can from this. So in some ways, this is a good news story, and they're sort of playing up the talk about kind of cost benefits for defense, etc., as Babcock would. But there's also the kind of the flip side of this, that the fact that we're having to effectively cannibalize ships that are being decommissioned in order to eke out additional life out of the remaining Anzac fleet is indicative of, or is driving the challenges within the fleet are driving this process. So I guess that on one level it's a good news story, but it speaks to the wider challenges that, as Jen loves to talk about, face the RAN's surface force at the moment.
I love to talk about it. It's kind of depressing, but I think it's important to highlight that these are decisions that were made a decade or so ago, and so often at the moment we see this discussion where I often see it on my social media feeds or on our YouTube feed, where it says we should be focusing on the next 3 to 5 years and not focusing on future capabilities. And I think the lesson from this is, if we did that, then we would be in the same position in 10, 15 years. So I think that we need to be able to do both. An effective military force design system needs to be able to look at how do you get the most out of the fleet in being, but also how do you plan for the future fleet? Because this extreme competition in the maritime domain is not going to cease in the next 5 years in our region. This is going to be, I think, my view, a prolonged state. And so we can't undermine future force design for current capability. We need to be able to do both. And so I think the lesson here is that because we didn't make decisions on the future fleet, a decade and a bit ago, and of course there's that's more complicated than I've just explained, is a lesson we should be thinking about right now as well. Speaking of future fleet, there's one more ship almost on its way. What ship is that?
So this is one of the OPVs. So this is the Arafura class OPV program, which has had a checkered history, I think it's fair to say. And new ship Carpentaria was laid down. The keel was laid at Henderson last week. So this is the kind of the first, or one of the first steps in building the ship, as they put the first of the modules down. And this is the last of the. I'm right in saying it's the last.
Yes,
one.
Yeah, right. It's hull number 6.
It is.
Yeah.
It is the last of the 4 that are being built in Western Australia, and then with the 2 that were built at Osborne in South Australia, that then will make the full 6 of the OPVs that will be built. Now, this program was a much larger one, and I think there are still kind of questions to be answered about quite how it fits in and whether or not Navy really wants these platforms anymore. But it's that they're certainly, hopefully, once they manage to get through all of the varying issues, and there were a lot of issues, particularly around the acceptance of the first of class HMAS Arafura, which was took a long time to be commissioned, and was only commissioned earlier this year. Hopefully, once they manage to work through all of those problems, these ships can come on stream relatively quickly and begin to take at least some of the pressure off other elements of the surface fleet.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've spoken a lot about the offshore patrol vessels, but it's good to see that at least be 2 in the fleet by the end of the year. Hey, we probably do need to wrap up, but before we wrap up, we do need to talk about blockades a little bit.
Absolutely. Go for it.
So I guess the key point, and maybe this is our did you know, since we've been a bit slack on the did you knows. So when we think about the maritime law, we often talk about UNCLOS, the UN Convention on Law of the Sea, which is incredibly important. But there is actually another legal regime that applies, which is the law of naval warfare. So the law of naval warfare is actually, this sounds like a lecture, but it's important. We keep getting questions about this on YouTube, so I'm going to address it. So the law of naval warfare is really what is the international law that is applicable to naval conflict. It covers, I guess, a range of things from prize law to the law of neutrality, law of armed conflict, and there are other bodies that do, I guess, apply to this. The point being is it is substantially customary law. So yes, there are a range of treaties, but a lot of it is developed through custom. It's often talked about as the San Remo manual is law of naval warfare. It's not, but it is a good attempt at trying to restate the law of naval warfare as it existed when that was produced. There are three main areas of it. The first one is really the rules and principles that govern the conduct of hostilities, including the legality of methods and means of naval warfare, and the protection of victims and civilians at sea. The second area is prize law, and then the third area is the law of maritime neutrality. Now, what we were asked to speak about is the law of blockade, the law of prize law. Would they apply in any future conflict in the Indo-Pacific, and is Australia susceptible to the idea of a distant blockade? A distant blockade being a blockade conducted on a country that is far from the coast, right? So close blockade, a blockade around a port, distant blockade, a much further. And actually, we don't call it a blockade, but there is a podcast. This is a double referral to another podcast. A podcast coming out between myself and the current Chief of the Royal Australian Navy, Vice Admiral Mark Hammond, which is for the Saltwater Strategy, the ANI, and he talks about the idea of the concern that Australia could be subject to a distant blockade. So I guess the point being that naval blockades, prize warfare are key elements of the law of naval warfare. They are still very much applicable, but built mostly on customary law. Now, when we think about the law when it comes to a naval blockade, there are certain criteria. Did you know there are certain criteria for the law of naval blockades, Richard? I think you did.
I did. I've written quite extensively about elements of this in a early 20th century context. But as I think we were flagging before, whilst that some of the custom has updated, many of the principles still remain.
They do, right? And so these key elements of a blockade are very much derived from customary law. One of the key elements must be established by declaration and notification. So you've got to tell people you're doing a blockade. Applied with impartiality, which is an interesting one. So it can't just apply to a certain country. It actually needs to apply to all. It must be enforced. Now, this criteria of it must be enforced is a difficult criteria. It's kind of a question of fact, i.e., do you actually have the ability to enforce it? Can't block access to neutral ports. So if you're going to blockade, for example, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, you're blocking access to some neutral ports. Now, Richard shakes his head. I'll get you to comment on that. But the third point, the fifth point being that you can't blockade things like supplies required for survival. So you can't conduct a blockade on a port that results in starvation, for example, because of the impact on the civilian population. When it comes to prize law, that was the other question. What is prize law? It really is, I guess, a term of art rather than a specific term in the law of armed conflict, but it denotes vessels or goods captured at sea. Prize law allows belligerent maritime forces, so those countries that are involved in the conflict and those vessels that have belligerent rights, we won't go into that, you'll be bored as hell as we talk through that, to capture enemy merchant vessels and civil aircraft as a right. And neutral merchant vessels or civil aircraft for a cause, i.e. if there's some specific reason around that. So the idea of prize law and the idea of blockade law built on customary law, key elements of the law of naval warfare, would apply in the event of an international armed conflict in the Indo-Pacific. And I actually do think it is something that we would see. Now, that's probably going too much into it. I haven't talked about prize law, courts and things like that. Richard, what do you want to talk about blockades and prize law?
Oh, I think that blockade absolutely remains a critical tool of naval warfare, and I think the law around it is still deeply unclear, and the way in which elements of customary law remain, but then you've had layered on top of it other elements. So, for example, the protection of civilians comes out of a much later set of international agreements. And if you then go back to some of the customary law around blockade, particularly around the discussion you were talking about neutral ports, and the idea that it has to be what was traditionally known as effective. And those concepts were pushed to their extreme in both world wars, to the degree that there was a lot of debate, certainly in the interwar and post-war period, about whether or not that the law of blockade had become basically a free-for-all. So I think it is absolutely a key element of naval power, and the degree to which it is that there are legal restrictions on it, I think would be highly contentious in a conflict. Because countries will exploit all kind of legal loopholes and everything else in order to be able to carry out the types of operations that they want to.
Very true. Now, that's probably all we do have time for. We've probably got a slightly longer episode, but hopefully we've answered some of those questions that have been asked on YouTube. Richard, thanks so much for another episode of Maritime Matters.
Great to chat, Jen.